One cannot, even as president, use the public trust of high office for personal gain. The question here is not a dispute about the enormous power that a president has. The question is whether, in this case, there was an abuse of that power.
Today, this very day, marks exactly 6 years since throngs of pro-Western Ukrainians spontaneously gathered on Kyiv's Independence Square to launch what became known as the Revolution of Dignity. While the protests began in opposition to a turn towards Russia and away from the West, they expanded over 3 months to reject the entire corrupt, repressive system that had been sustained by Russian influence in the country. Those events were followed by Russia's occupation of Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula, an invasion of Ukraine's eastern Donbas region, and an ensuing war that to date has cost almost 14,000 lives. Despite the Russian aggression over the past 5 years, Ukrainians have rebuilt a shattered economy, adhered to a peace process, and moved economically and socially closer to the West, toward our way of life. Earlier this year, large majorities of Ukrainians again chose a fresh start by voting for a political newcomer as president, replacing 80% of their parliament and endorsing a platform consistent with our democratic values, our reform priorities, and our strategic interests. This year's revolution at the ballot box underscores that despite its imperfections, Ukraine is a genuine and vibrant democracy and an example to other post-Soviet countries and beyond, from Moscow to Hong Kong.
I come before you as an American citizen who has devoted the majority of my life, 33 years, to service to the country that all of us love. From August 2016 until May 2019, I served as the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine.
Did anyone at the State Department ever express concerns about your job performance?
No.
I have the highest regard for Ambassador Yovanovitch.
I asked her to extend until the end of this year to get through the election cycle in Ukraine, and then Undersecretary Hale in March asked her to stay until 2020.
Now, some in Ukraine probably disliked her efforts to help Ukraine root out corruption. Is that correct?
As I mentioned in my testimony, you can't promote principled anti-corruption action without pissing off corrupt people.
Thus, perhaps it was not surprising that when our anti-corruption efforts got in the way of a desire for profit or power, Ukrainians who preferred to play by the old corrupt rules sought to remove me.
I first heard about former Mayor Giuliani's interest in Ukraine in January of this year.
When you were in Ukraine, you understood that Rudy Giuliani was Donald Trump's personal lawyer. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Are you familiar with Rudy Giuliani's quote in the New York Times describing himself as the lawyer saying, quote, "He basically knows what I'm doing, comma, sure, as his lawyer." Were you familiar with that quote?
It sounds familiar.
Over the course of 2018 and 2019, I became increasingly aware of an effort by Rudy Giuliani and others, including his associates Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman, to run a campaign to smear Ambassador Yovanovitch and other officials at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv.
It appears that as early as April of 2018, Mr. Parnas was at a fundraiser for the president and recommended that you be removed, and then subsequently in May of 2018 was pictured at a White House dinner with the president, and then later in May made a contribution of over $325,000 illegally to the president's re-election campaign. Does that help you understand a little bit more why this smear campaign was underway?
Yes.
The chief agitators on the Ukrainian side of this effort were some of those same corrupt former prosecutors I had encountered, particularly Yuri Lutsenko and Viktor Shokin. They were now peddling false information in order to extract revenge against those who had exposed their misconduct. The then Prosecutor General of Ukraine, now ex, Yuri Lutsenko, met Rudy Giuliani in New York on a private visit in January. They had a second meeting in February.
February of earlier this year. You spoke to a minister in Ukraine who warned that when it came to Rudy Giuliani, you needed to, quote, watch your back.
He said that Mr. Lutsenko was working with Mayor Giuliani through these two individuals, Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman, basically wanted to remove me from post. In early March 2019, the smear campaign against me entered a new public phase in the United States.
What Mr. Giuliani was saying was pretty explosive in any case. He was frequently on television making quite incendiary remarks about everyone involved in this, and that he was clearly pushing forward issues and ideas that would, probably come back to haunt us. And in fact, I think that that's where we are today.
And through the good offices of the former mayor of New York, Yuri Lutsenko gave an interview to John Solomon, then of The Hill, in early March, and the campaign was launched on March 20th.
Resulted in a series of articles in the Hill publication that were based on allegations in part from Lutsenko, the corrupt prosecutor general. And just to summarize some of these allegations, there were, among others, 3 different categories. One category included the attacks against you, which you referenced in your opening statement, including that you had badmouthed the president and had given the prosecutor general a do not prosecute list. There was another that included allegations of Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election. And then there was a third that related to allegations concerning Burisma and the Bidens. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Did anyone in the State Department raise any concerns with you or express any belief in these allegations?
No, I mean, people thought it was ridiculous.
This is the president's son, Donald Trump Jr., who tweets, "We need more at Richard Grenell's," who's the ambassador to Germany, is that right?
That's correct.
"And less of these jokers as ambassadors." And it's a retweet of an article referencing the allegations that says, "Calls grow to remove Obama's U.S. ambassador to Ukraine." A tweet here by President Trump himself on March 20th, which was the first day that one of these articles was published. It appears to be a quote that says, "John Solomon," who's the author of the articles, "as Russia collusion fades, Ukrainian plot to help Clinton emerges," unquote, at Sean Hannity at Fox News. Were you aware whether they received attention on primetime television on Fox News as well?
Yes.
Ambassador Yovanovitch, as we sit here testifying, the president is attacking you on Twitter, and I'd like to give you a chance to respond. I'll read part of one of his tweets. "Everywhere Marie Yovanovitch went turned bad. She started off in Somalia. How did that go? What effect do you think that has on other witnesses' willingness to come forward and expose wrongdoing?"
Well, it's very intimidating.
The barrage of allegations directed at Ambassador Yovanovitch, a career ambassador, is unlike anything I have seen in my professional career. It was not clear to us why this was happening or why people weren't standing up for her.
Well, we were concerned. We put out a statement that some of these allegations are an outright fabrication as they related to the do not prosecute list.
Right.
And we began to discuss what we could do to deal with this matter.
Right.
And I had already brought to Ambassador Bolton's attention the shameful way in which Ambassador Yovanovitch was being smeared and attacked. And I'd asked if there was anything that we could do about it. And Ambassador Bolton had looked pained, basically indicated with body language that there was nothing much that we could do about it. And he then, in the course of that discussion, said that Rudy Giuliani was a hand grenade that was going to blow everyone up.
In the face of this smear campaign, did colleagues at the State Department try to get a statement of support for you from Secretary Pompeo?
Yes.
Were they successful?
No. I'd hoped that there would be more public support.
Did you expect them to have your back?
Yes.
And were you surprised when you found out they weren't going to?
Not at that point anymore.
And Secretary Pompeo was aware of her situation. Is that correct?
Yes, I briefed him the next day.
You testified around the same time. He made 2 phone calls to Rudy Giuliani. Is that right?
That's correct.
I was then abruptly told, just weeks later in late April, to come back to Washington from Ukraine on the next plane. And I asked her why, and she said she wasn't sure, but there were concerns about my security. When I returned to the United States, Deputy Secretary of State Sullivan told me there had been a concerted campaign against me, that the president no longer wished me to serve as ambassador to Ukraine, and that, in fact, the president had been pushing for my removal since the prior summer. Neither he nor anyone else ever explained or sought to justify the president's concerns about me, nor did anyone in the department justify my early departure by suggesting I had done something wrong.
But in your 33 years as a Foreign Service officer, have you ever heard of a president of the United States recalling another ambassador without cause based on allegations that the State Department itself knew to be false?
No.
Is it fair to say that other ambassadors and others of lesser rank who serve the United States and embassies around the world might look at this and think, if I take on corrupt people in these countries, that could happen to me?
I think that's a fair statement, yes. Although then and now, I have always understood that I served at the pleasure of the president, I still find it difficult to comprehend that foreign and private interests were able to undermine U.S. interests in this way.
Commentators in Ukraine were already aware of Mr. Giuliani and his influence, the issues that he was promoting, and ultimately that he was able to get an ambassador removed. And then in addition, immediately after the inauguration, he began reaching out to the Zelensky administration.
On May 28th of this year, I met with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who asked me to rejoin the State Department and return to Kyiv to lead our embassy in Ukraine. I wanted to say yes, but it was not an easy decision. The former ambassador, Masha Ivanovich, has been treated poorly, caught in a web of political machinations both in Kyiv and in Washington. I could be effective only if the U.S. policy of strong support for Ukraine, strong diplomatic support, along with robust security, economic, and technical assistance were to continue. And I worried about what I had heard concerning the role of Rudy Giuliani, who had made several controversial statements about Ukraine and U.S. policy toward the country.
Ultimately, Ambassador Taylor got appointed. Is Ambassador Taylor the kind of person that would further Giuliani's aims? And I think we can all agree that Ambassador Taylor is a remarkable public servant.
Absolutely.
But what if the president could put someone else in place that wasn't a career diplomat? What if he could put in place, say, a substantial donor to his inaugural? What if he could put in place someone with no diplomatic experience at all? What if he could put in place someone whose portfolio doesn't even include Ukraine? Might that person be willing to work with Rudy Giuliani in pursuit of these investigations?
Yeah, maybe.
That's exactly what happened, wasn't it?
Yes.
Isn't it the case that your departure and the 1-month gap between the time you left and when Ambassador Taylor arrived provided the perfect opportunity for another group of people to basically take over Ukraine policy? Isn't that right?
Yeah.
And in fact, you flew home from Kiev on the same day as the inauguration of Ukraine's new president?
That's true.
That inauguration was attended by three who have become known as the Three Amigos, Ambassadors Sondland, Volker, and Perry, was it?
Yes.
And 3 days after that inauguration, in a meeting with President Trump, are you aware that the president designated these Three Amigos to coordinate Ukraine policy with Rudy Giuliani?
Since then, I've become aware of that.
This was after Ambassador Yovanovitch had been pushed out of her position. And it was at that juncture that Ambassador Sondland's role seemed to grow larger.
And did you express any concerns to him directly?
I did express concerns to him directly.
What were those concerns?
I asked him quite bluntly in a meeting that we had in June of 2019. So this is after the presidential inauguration, when I'd seen that he had started to step up in much more of a proactive role on Ukraine. what was his role here? And he said that he was in charge of Ukraine. And I said, well, who put you in charge, Ambassador Sondland? And he said, the president.
Did that surprise you when he told you that?
It did surprise me. We'd had no directive. We hadn't been told this. He said his job was to go out and make deals in Europe. And as you know yourself, I listened to his testimony yesterday very carefully as well. He said that anything that had to do with the EU itself and the European Union member states was within his portfolio.
Right.
He had also been a large donor to one of President Trump's campaign committees. Is that correct?
I have learned that.
It's a little unusual for the U.S. ambassador to the EU to play a role in Ukraine policy.
Okay. And, it might be irregular, but it's certainly not outlandish. And it's not as outlandish as it could be. Is that correct?
It's not as outlandish as it could be. Yeah, I agree, Mr. Kast.
On April 21st, Volodymyr Zelensky won the Ukrainian presidential election. On April 23rd, the vice president called to congratulate President-elect Zelensky. During the call, which I participated in, the vice president accepted an invitation to attend President-elect Zelensky's upcoming inauguration, providing that the scheduling worked out.
The April 21st call, that is the first call between President Trump and President Zelensky. Did you prepare talking points for the president to use during that call?
Yes, I did.
And did those talking points include rooting out corruption in Ukraine?
Yes.
That was something the president was supposed to raise in the conversation with President Zelensky?
Those were the recommended talking points that were cleared through the NSC staff for the president, yes.
Did you listen in on that call?
Yes, I did.
The White House has now released the record of that call. Did President Trump ever mention corruption in the April 21st call?
To the best of my recollection, he did not.
Following that call, Ms. Williams, was your understanding that the president wanted the vice president to attend the inauguration in Kyiv?
Yes, that was my understanding.
And is it not true that everybody on the ground thought or was filled with optimism that Ukraine was getting serious about combating corruption?
That is correct.
I can say that I myself and many others at the NSC and in the State Department were quite keen, very eager to have Vice President Pence go to Ukraine to represent the United States government and the president.
And is that also your recollection, Mr. Holmes, that you wanted Vice President Pence to attend?
Yes, sir, and we understood that was the plan.
I want to point to a New York Times article from last week that says that Lev Parnas' attorney, you've heard of this gentleman, Lev Parnas, an associate of Rudy Giuliani. Who's
only what I've read very recently.
He's recently indicted.
Yeah.
Mr. Parnas told a representative of the incoming government, the Zelensky government, that it had to announce an investigation into Trump's political rival, Joseph R. Biden and his son, or else Vice President Mike Pence would not attend the swearing-in of the new president, and the United States would freeze aid.
On May 13th, an assistant to the vice president's chief of staff called and informed me that President Trump had decided that the vice president would not attend the inauguration in Ukraine.
You were instructed that the president had told the vice president not to go before you even knew the date of the inauguration. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Were you aware in the interim between the president telling him to go and the president telling him not to go that Rudy Giuliani had to abort a trip that he was going to make to Ukraine?
I had seen that in the press, yes.
On May 9th, the New York Times reported that Rudy Giuliani planned to travel to Ukraine and, quote, shortly to meet with President Zelensky to urge him to pursue the 2016 election and the involvement of Hunter Biden in Burisma, unquote.
And had you seen in the press that Rudy Giuliani blamed people around Zelensky for having to cancel the trip?
I had read that in the press reporting, yes.
And did you read in the press reporting also that Giuliani wanted to go to Ukraine to, as he put it, not meddle in an election, but meddle in investigations?
I did read that, yes.
And that occurred prior to the president canceling the vice president's trip to the inauguration?
It did. I believe it was around May 10th or so.
Was Mr. Giuliani promoting U.S. national interests or policy in Ukraine, Ambassador?
I don't think so, ma'am.
Mr. Kent?
No, he was not.
What interest do you believe he was promoting, Mr. Kent?
I believe he was looking to dig up political dirt against a potential rival in the next election cycle.
Ambassador Taylor? What interest do you believe he was promoting?
I agree with Mr. Kent.
In fact, Mr. Giuliani has made no secret of the fact that he is acting on behalf of President Trump. As Mr. Giuliani told the New York Times, and I'm going to put this on the screen, he told them, quote, "My only client is the President of the United States. He's the one I have the obligation to report to, tell him what happens." He added that the investigations would be, quote, "very, very helpful to my client and may turn out to be helpful to my government."
But back on May 6th, when asked about a news report about the role of former Vice President's son on Burisma, President Trump told Fox News that it was, and I quote, "a major scandal, major problem."
Colonel, is it fair to say that the Ukrainian officials were concerned about Mr. Giuliani's advances?
Yes, they were.
In your assessment, did they understand the political nature of the request being asked of them?
I believe they did.
The inauguration took place on May 20th, and I took notes in the delegation's meeting with President Zelensky.
Now, do you also recall that Colonel Vindman spoke to President Zelensky in that meeting?
Yes.
And what did he say to President Zelensky in terms of some of the issues that we're addressing here in this investigation?
Yes, sir. He was the last to speak. He made a general point about the importance of Ukraine to our national security, and he said it's very important that the Zelensky administration stay out of U.S. domestic politics.
Was it your understanding that President Zelensky and the Ukrainians were already starting to feel some pressure to conduct these political investigations?
Yes.
And those were the ones related to Biden and Burisma in the 2016 election?
Correct. Over the following months, it became apparent that Mr. Giuliani was having a direct influence on the foreign policy agenda. In fact, at one point during a preliminary meeting of the inaugural delegation, someone wondered aloud why Mr. Giuliani was so active in the media with respect to Ukraine. My recollection is that Ambassador Sondland stated, quote, "Damn it, Rudy, every time Rudy gets involved, he goes and F's everything up."
And 3 days after that inauguration, in a meeting with President Trump, are you aware that the president designated these three amigos to coordinate Ukraine policy with Rudy Giuliani?
Since then, I've become aware of that.
They gave us every impression that they were meeting with Rudy Giuliani at this point, and Rudy Giuliani was also saying on the television, and indeed has said subsequently, that he was closely coordinating with the State Department. So it was my belief that they were meeting with him.
On May 23rd, Ambassador Volker, Ambassador Sondland, Secretary Perry, and Senator Ron Johnson, who had also attended the inauguration, though not on the official delegation, returned to the United States and briefed President Trump. On May 29th, President Trump signed a congratulatory letter to President Zelensky, which included an invitation to visit the White House at an unspecified date.
You said that you were nervous about that. Why were you nervous, Dr. Hill?
Because at this juncture, it had become quite apparent that the president wasn't very keen on having a meeting with Mr. Zelensky for all the reasons that we've been trying to lay out today. And we were, once one puts in a letter like that, you raise the expectation of an invitation coming shortly.
How important to President Zelensky was a White House meeting?
New leaders, particularly countries that are trying to have good footing in the international arena, see a meeting with the U.S. President in the Oval Office at the White House as the ultimate sign of endorsement and support from the United States.
Would a White House meeting for President Zelensky boost his legitimacy as a new president in Ukraine?
It would primarily boost his leverage to negotiate with Vladimir Putin about the Russian occupation of 7% of Ukrainian territory.
From May onwards, it became very clear that the White House meeting itself was being predicated on other issues, namely investigations.
Investigations was a term Ambassadors Volker and Sondland used to mean matters related to the 2016 elections and to investigations of Burisma and the Bidens. But during my subsequent communications with Ambassadors Volker and Sondland, they relayed to me that the President wanted to hear from Zelensky before scheduling the meeting in the Oval Office. It was not clear to me what this meant. On June 27th, Ambassador Sondland told me during a phone conversation that President Zelensky needed to make clear to President Trump that he, President Zelensky, was not standing in the way of investigations. I sensed something odd when Ambassador Sondland told me on June 28th that he did not wish to include most of the regular interagency participants in a call planned with President Zelensky later that day. Ambassador Sondland, Ambassador Volker, Secretary Perry, and I were on this call, dialing in from different locations. However, Ambassador Sondland said he wanted to make sure no one was transcribing or monitoring as they added President Zelensky to the call. Also, before President Zelensky joined the call, Ambassador Volker separately told the U.S. participants that he, Ambassador Volker, planned to be explicit with President Zelensky in a one-on-one meeting in Toronto on July 2nd. In that meeting, Ambassador Volker planned to make clear what President Zelensky should do to get the White House meeting. I did not understand what this meant, but Ambassador Volker said he would relay that President Trump wanted to see rule of law, transparency, but also specifically cooperation on investigations to get to the bottom of things.
The suggestion that we were engaged in some irregular or rogue diplomacy is absolutely false. I have now identified certain State Department emails and messages that provide contemporaneous support for my view. These emails show that the leadership of the State Department, the National Security Council, and the White House were all informed about the Ukraine efforts from May 23, 2019, until the security aid was released on September 11, 2019. Our efforts were reported and approved, and not once do I recall encountering an objection. Secretary Perry, Ambassador Volker, and I worked with Mr. Rudy Giuliani on Ukraine matters at the express direction of the President of the United States. We did not want to work with Mr. Giuliani. Simply put, we were playing the hand we were dealt. Nonetheless, based on the President's direction, we were faced with a choice. We could abandon the efforts to schedule the White House phone call and a White House visit between Presidents Trump and Zelensky, which was unquestionably in our foreign policy interest, or we could do as President Trump had directed and talk with Rudy. We chose the latter course, not because we liked it, but because it was the only constructive path open to us. Mr. Giuliani demanded that Ukraine make a public statement announcing the investigations of the 2016 election DNC server and Burisma. Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the President of the United States, and we knew these investigations were important to the President.
Well, and you said that Mr. Giuliani was acting at the President's demand, correct?
Right. When the President says, talk to my personal lawyer, Mr. Giuliani, we followed his direction.
You've testified that the White House meeting that President Zelensky desperately wanted, and that was very important to President Zelensky, was it not?
Absolutely.
You've testified that that meeting was conditioned, was a quid pro quo for what the President wanted, these two investigations. Is that right?
Correct.
And that everybody knew it?
Correct.
Now, that White House meeting was going to be an official meeting between the two presidents, correct?
Presumably.
It would be an Oval Office meeting, hopefully?
A working meeting, yes.
A working meeting, so an official act, correct? But he had to get those two investigations if that official act was going to take place, correct?
He had to announce the investigations. He didn't actually have to do them, as I understood it.
Okay. President Zelensky had to announce the two investigations the President wanted, make a public announcement, correct?
Correct.
The State Department's role is to promote U.S. policies overseas, not to help the current president win re-election. Is that correct, Mr. Kent?
All federal government employees are subject to the Hatch Act, and our actions are supposed to be promoting policy and not involved in partisan politics.
Ambassador Taylor?
I agree.
Was investigating President Trump's political opponents a part of those necessary reforms? Was it on that list of your, or indeed was it on any list?
No, they weren't.
Also on June 28th, while President Trump was still not moving forward on a meeting with President Zelensky, he met with Russian President Putin at the G20 summit in Osaka, Japan, sending a further signal of lack of support to Ukraine.
Now, moving to July 10th, you sent a text message to Giuliani, and I think it's on the screen now. And you said, Mr. Mayor, could we meet for coffee or lunch in the next week or so? I'd like to update you on my conversations about Ukraine. I think we have an opportunity to get what you need. Did you say that? Is that an accurate?
That is an accurate text message.
Now, Dr. Hill, you indicated earlier that you had understood that a White House meeting was conditioned on the pursuit by Ukraine of these investigations. And I want to focus on the July 10th meeting in the White House where that came to light. Now, toward the end of this meeting, the Ukrainians raised their ongoing desire for an Oval Office meeting. Is that right?
That's correct.
And what happened after they did that?
As Ambassador Bolton was trying to move that part of the discussion away, I think he was going to try to deflect it onto another wrap-up topic, Ambassador Sondland leaned in basically to say, well, we have an agreement that there will be a meeting if specific investigations are put underway. And that's when I saw Ambassador Bolton stiffen. I was sitting behind him in the chair, and I saw him sit back slightly like this. He'd been more moving forward like I am to the table. And for me, that was an unmistakable body language, and it caught my attention. And then he looked up to the clock and, at his watch, or towards his wrist in any case. Again, I was sitting behind him, and basically he said, well, it's been really great to see you. I'm afraid I've got another meeting. And he was escorting out the Ukrainian visitors, along with Secretary Perry and Ambassadors Volker and Sondland. And I guess they wanted to take a quick photograph outside of his office. This was very quick. He came back in, and at that point, Ambassador Sondland had said, let's regroup in the wardroom for a quick huddle on next steps, which, to be honest, was quite unusual. And when Ambassador Bolton came back into the office, that's when he gave me the very strong instruction to go downstairs, find out what was being discussed, and to come right back up and report it to him. And as I came into the wardroom, Alex Vindman, Colonel Vindman, and Ambassador Sondland were in an exchange, and that's when I noticed that Colonel Vindman looked quite alarmed. Gordon Sondland was basically saying, well, look, we have a deal here that there will be a meeting. I have a deal here with Chief of Staff Mulvaney. There will be a meeting if the Ukrainians open up or announce these investigations into 2016 in Burisma. And I cut it off immediately there. Because by this point, having heard Mr. Giuliani over and over again on the television and all of the issues that he was asserting, by this point it was clear that Burisma was code for the Bidens, because Giuliani was laying it out there. I could see why Colonel Vindman was alarmed, and he said, this is inappropriate with the National Security Council, we can't be involved in this.
And did Ambassador Sondland say who his agreement on this White House meeting was with?
Later, he said that he had an agreement with Chief of Staff Mulvaney that in return for investigations, this meeting would get scheduled.
And was he specific at that point later about the investigations that he was referring to?
He said the investigations in Burisma.
Now, did you have a conversation with Ambassador Bolton after this subsequent meeting with Ambassador Sondland?
When I came back and related it to him, he had some very specific instruction for me, that I had to go to the lawyers, to John Eisenberg, our senior counsel for the National Security Council, to basically say, you tell Eisenberg, Ambassador Bolton told me, that I am not part of this whatever drug deal that Mulvaney and Sondland are cooking up.
What did you understand him to mean by the drug deal that Mulvaney and Sondland were cooking up?
I took it to mean investigations for a meeting.
Did you go speak to the lawyers?
I certainly did.
Ever been instructed to go report something to the NSC lawyer before?
That was the first time. I've self-instructed a couple of times, but that was the first time I have been instructed to go. I've self-instructed a couple of times.
A conspiracy was launched against you by convicted felon Roger Stone on the show InfoWars, led by Alex Jones, right? We here at InfoWars, this is Roger Stone speaking, first identified Fiona Hill, the globalist leftist George Soros insider who had infiltrated McMaster's staff. He said that on May 31st, 2017. I presume you're not a globalist leftist Soros insider, correct?
I think my coal mining family would be very surprised to hear all of these things about me. And in fact, just more recently, before Mr. Stone endured his trial, they were at it again, reprising the same InfoWars video and adding embellishment.
Dr. Hill, you testified that you handed over your duties on the NSC to Tim Morrison on July 15th and that you physically left the White House on July 19th, correct?
That is correct, yes. Very unfortunately, I had a bit of a blow-up with Ambassador Sondland, and I had a couple of testy encounters with him. One of those in my last week in the office.
He indicated you were upset, and you were upset with Ambassador Bolton and upset with the way things are going, and I believe your counsel said that was an outright fabrication.
I was actually, to be honest, angry with him. And, I hate to say it, but often when women show anger, it's not fully appreciated. It's often, pushed onto emotional issues, perhaps, or deflected onto other people. And what I was angry about was that he wasn't coordinating with us. Now, I actually realized, having listened to his deposition, that he was absolutely right. That he wasn't coordinating with us because we weren't doing the same thing that he was doing. So I was upset with him that he wasn't fully telling us about all of the meetings that he was having. And he said to me, but I'm briefing the president. I'm briefing Chief of Staff Mulvaney. I'm briefing Secretary Pompeo, and I've talked to Ambassador Bolton. Who else do I have to deal with? And the point is we have a robust interagency process that deals with Ukraine. It includes Mr. Holmes. It includes Ambassador Taylor as the chargé in Ukraine. It includes a whole load of other people. But it struck me yesterday when you put up on the screen Ambassador Sondland's emails and who was on these emails, and he said, these are the people who need to know, that he was absolutely right, because he was being involved in a domestic political errand. And we were being involved in national security foreign policy, and those two things had just diverged. So he was correct, and I had not put my finger on that at the moment, but I was irritated with him and angry with him that he wasn't fully coordinating. And I did say to him, Ambassador Sondland, Gordon, I think this is all going to blow up, and here we are. Remember, I left on July 19th, and the call took place the following week.
I emailed Tim Morrison. He had just taken over Dr. Hill's post as the NSC Eurasia Director, and I met him that day for the first time. I wrote to Mr. Morrison with these words: the call between Zelensky and POTUS, President of the United States, should happen before 7/21, which is the parliamentary elections in Ukraine. Sole purpose is for Zelensky to give POTUS assurances of new sheriff in town, corruption ending, unbundling moving forward, and I emphasize, any hampered investigations will be allowed to move forward transparently. Goal is for POTUS to invite him to Oval. Volker, Perry, Bolton, and I strongly recommend. Mr. Morrison acknowledged and said thank you, and specifically noted that he was tracking these issues. Again, there was no secret regarding moving forward and the discussion of investigations.
No one wrote back to you and said, what are you talking about in terms of these investigations and turning over every stone?
No.
On July 3rd, I learned that the Office of Management and Budget had placed a hold on a tranche of security assistance designated for Ukraine.
You certified that as far as it related to your duties, Ukraine had met the corruption concerns for the aid to be released. Is that right?
Sir, the Defense Department certified.
And after that date, inexplicably, the President of the United States puts a hold on security assistance. Is that right?
That was what I heard in July, yes.
And did they give reasons beyond that it was being withheld by the White House Chief of Staff?
Not specifically. The reason given was that there was an ongoing review whether the funding was still in line with administration priorities.
Did anyone in any of those meetings or in any other subsequent discussion you had discuss the legality of withholding that aid?
Defense and State Department officials were looking into how they would handle a situation in which earmarked funding from Congress that was designated for Ukraine would be resolved if the funding continued to be held as we approach the end of the fiscal year.
My staff also advised me on July 3rd at 4:23 p.m., they received an email from the State Department stating that they had heard that the CN is currently being blocked by OMB. This apparently refers to the congressional notification state would send for Ukraine FMF.
Were you aware of anyone in the national security community who supported withholding the aid?
No.
No one from the national security?
None.
No one from the State Department?
Correct.
No one from the Department of Defense?
Correct.
This specific assistance helps build the capacity of the Ukrainian armed forces. And it's important to understand that these are forces that are fighting to defend themselves against Russian aggression every day. It's an ongoing war. So
I and others sat in astonishment. The Ukrainians were fighting Russians and counted on not only the training and weapons, but also the assurance of U.S. support. All that the OMB staff person said was that the directive had come from the President to the Chief of Staff to OMB. In an instant, I realized that one of the key pillars of our strong support for Ukraine was threatened.
This is July 19th, before the July 25th call.
In my email, I obviously had just spoken with him, and he being Zelensky, and he said that he was prepared to receive the call and he would make those assurances to President Trump on that call, and then presumably that would then lead to the White House meeting.
Right after you sent this email assuring the others that he will discuss the investigations and will turn over every stone, the Burisma and 2016 election investigations, Mr. Mulvaney responded that he asked to set up the call for the next day. Is that right?
That's what it says.
In front of you is another text message from you that same morning.
Right.
So this is slightly less than a half hour before the call between President Trump and President Zelensky.
It says, good lunch, thanks. Heard from White House. Assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate, get to the bottom of what happened in 2016, we will nail down date for a visit to Washington. Good luck. See you tomorrow, Kurt.
And does this accurately relay the message that you had received from Ambassador Sondland?
Yes.
Mr. Morrison, you also testified that Ambassador Sondland emailed you and several White House staff to say that he briefed President Trump in advance of his July 25th call with the Ukrainian president. Is that correct?
Yes, Congressman. On July 25th, President Trump made a congratulatory phone call to President Zelensky after his party won a commanding majority in Ukraine's parliamentary election. Contrary to standard procedure, the embassy received no readout of that call, and I was unaware of what was discussed until the transcript was released on September 25th. Upon reading the transcript, I was deeply disappointed to see that the President raised none of what I understood to be our interagency agreed upon foreign policy priorities in Ukraine, and instead raised the Biden-Burisma investigation and referred to the theory about CrowdStrike and its supposed connection to Ukraine in the 2016 election.
On July 25th at approximately 9 a.m., you both were sitting in the Situation Room, probably not too much further away than you are right now. And you were preparing for a long-awaited phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky. Now, Colonel Vindman, in advance of this phone call, did you prepare talking points as you did for the April 21st call?
Yes, I did.
What were those talking points based upon?
It was cooperation on supporting his reform agenda, anti-corruption efforts, and helping President Zelensky implement his plans to end Russia's war against Ukraine.
As you listened to the call, did you observe whether President Trump was following the talking points based on the official U.S. policy?
Counsel, the president could choose to use the talking points or not. He's the president, but they were not consistent with what I provided, yes.
On July 25th, along with several of my colleagues, I listened to a call between President Trump and President Zelensky.
Let's take a look at a couple of excerpts from this call. And right after President Zelensky thanked President Trump for the United States' support in the area of defense, President Trump asks President Zelensky for a favor and then raises this theory of Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election. He says in the highlighted portion, "I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot and Ukraine knows a lot about it. I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation with Ukraine. They say CrowdStrike. I guess you have one of your wealthy people, the server. They say Ukraine has it." Now, Colonel Vindman, was this statement based on the official talking points that you had prepared?
No.
And was this statement related to the 2016 Ukraine interference in the 2016 election part of the official U.S. policy?
No, it was not.
Now, at the time of this July 25th call, Colonel Vindman, were you aware of a theory that Ukraine had intervened or interfered in the 2016 U.S. election?
I was.
Are you aware of any credible evidence to support this theory?
I am not.
Are you also aware that Vladimir Putin had promoted this theory of Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election?
I am well aware of that fact.
And ultimately, which country did U.S. intelligence services determine to have interfered in the 2016 election?
It is the consensus of the entire intelligence community that the Russians interfered in U.S. elections in 2016.
Isn't it also true that some of President Trump's most senior advisors had informed him that this theory of Ukraine interference in the 2016 election was false?
That's correct.
Now, I want to go back to the July 25th call right now, where President Trump, in another excerpt, asked President Zelensky about his potential political opponent, Vice President Joe Biden. In this excerpt, the president said, "The other thing, there's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of people want to find out about that. So whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution, so if you can look into it. It sounds horrible to me." Now, Dr. Hill, this was, of course, one of the allegations that Rudy Giuliani was pushing, is that right?
That's correct.
And now it confirmed in this July 25th call that the president was also interested in it?
Yes.
You found the allegations against Joe Biden related to his son or Burisma not to be believed?
Simply because I've known former Vice President Biden for a long time. I know how he respects his duties of higher office, and it's just not credible to me.
And in fact, Mr. Holmes, the former Prosecutor General of Ukraine, who Vice President Biden encouraged to fire, was actually corrupt, is that right?
Correct.
And was not pursuing corruption investigations and prosecutions, right?
My understanding is the Prosecutor General at the time, Shokin, was not at that time pursuing investigations of Burisma or the Bidens.
And in fact, removing that corrupt prosecutor general was part of the United States anti-corruption policy, isn't that correct?
That's correct, and not just us, but all of our allies and other institutions that were involved in Ukraine at the time.
And in fact, if he helped to remove a corrupt Ukrainian prosecutor general who was not prosecuting enough corruption, that would increase the chances that corrupt companies in Ukraine would be investigated. Isn't that right?
One would think so.
And that could include Burisma, right?
Yes.
President of the United States, whether it's Donald Trump or any future president, asking another nation where there's rampant corruption to investigate a political rival or just any other American citizen, what would be the danger to that American?
Congressman, the Ukrainian judiciary is imperfect at the moment, and the reliance on U.S. support could conceivably cause them to tip the scales of justice in favor of finding the U.S. citizen guilty if they thought they needed to do that in their national.
So they could trump up charges if they wanted to in a corrupt system like that.
They could, and Ukraine is making progress. Certainly, more broadly in Russia, that is likely to happen, where the state will be involved in judicial outcomes and drive them.
It's also true, is it not, that these two investigations that the president asked Zelensky for into 2016 and into the Bidens were precisely the two investigations that Rudy Giuliani was calling for publicly, were they not?
That is correct.
Was the request that Ukraine investigate CrowdStrike and the Bidens consistent with what you understood to be official U.S. policy towards combating corruption in Ukraine?
Sir, it was the first I heard of much of this.
In that same July 25th phone call, he said, Mr. Giuliani is a highly respected man. He was the mayor of New York City, a great mayor, and I would like him to call you. I will ask him to call you along with the Attorney General. Rudy very much knows what's happening, and he is a very capable guy. And after this, President Trump then mentions Mr. Giuliani twice more in that call. What did you think when President Trump told President Zelensky, and you read that you were going to go through some things?
I didn't know what to think, but I was very concerned.
What were you concerned about?
She's going to go through some things. It didn't sound good. It sounded like a threat.
Did you feel threatened?
I did.
Now, in this same call where the president, as you just said, threatens you to a foreign leader, he also praises the corrupt Ukrainian prosecutor who led the false smear campaign against you. I want to show you another excerpt or two from the transcript, or the call record rather, where the President of the United States says, "Good, because I heard you had a prosecutor who was very good and he was shut down, and that's really unfair. A lot of people are talking about that. The way they shut your very good prosecutor down, and you had some very bad people involved." And he went on later to say, "I heard the prosecutor was treated very badly, and he was a very fair prosecutor, so good luck with everything." Now, Ambassador Yovanovitch, after nearly 3 years in Ukraine where you tried to clean up the Prosecutor General's office, was it the U.S. Embassy's view that the former Prosecutor General was a very good and very fair prosecutor?
No, it was not.
And in fact, he was rather corrupt, is that right?
That was our belief.
The Prosecutor General's office is a long-running problem in Ukraine, is that right?
Yes.
So how did you feel when you heard President Trump speak so highly of the corrupt Ukrainian prosecutor who helped to execute the smear campaign to have you removed?
Well, it was disappointing. It was concerning. It wasn't certainly based on anything that the State Department would have reported, or frankly, anybody else in the U.S. government.
Now, let's go to then the last excerpt that I wanted to highlight, which is President Zelensky speaking, and he says, "I also wanted to thank you for your invitation to visit the United States, specifically Washington, D.C. On the other hand, I also want to ensure you that we will be very serious about the case and we will work on the investigation." Now, Ambassador Taylor, right after President Zelensky mentions his much-desired Washington visit, he says, on the other hand, and then says that Ukraine will be very serious about the investigation. Is this the same link between the White House visit and the investigations that Ambassador Volker had texted to Andrei Yermak just a few minutes before this conversation?
That's my assumption.
Now, just to summarize what we've just read in this July 25th call between the presidents, the Ukrainian president thanked President Trump for security assistance that President Trump had just frozen, to which President Trump responded that he wanted President Zelensky to do him a favor, though, by investigating the 2016 U.S. election and the Bidens. Then President Zelensky says that he will pursue these investigations right after he mentions the White House visit. Is that your understanding, Ambassador Taylor, of what we just read?
Yes.
And Mr. Kent, is that yours?
Yes. I was concerned by the call. What I heard was inappropriate, and I reported my concerns to Mr. Eisenberg. It is improper for the President of the United States to demand a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen and a political opponent. It was also clear that if Ukraine pursued an investigation into the 2016 elections, the Bidens and Burisma, it would be interpreted as a partisan play. This would undoubtedly result in Ukraine losing bipartisan support, undermining U.S. national security, and advancing Russia's strategic objectives in the region.
Now, at some point, did you also discuss how the written summary of the call record should be handled with the NSC lawyers?
Following the report, there was a discussion in the legal shop on the best way to manage the transcript, yes.
What did you understand they concluded?
My understanding is that this was viewed as a sensitive transcript, and to avoid leaks, and if I recall the term properly, or something along the lines of preserve the integrity of the transcript, it should be segregated to a smaller group of folks.
The two concerns I had were, one, I did not see representatives of NSC Legal on the call, and so I wanted to make sure that the legal advisor and his deputy were aware of the call, and I was also concerned about taking steps to protect the MEMCON, limit its disclosure for fear of the consequences of it leaking. And political consequences was an umbrella term I used in my statement to describe a series of effects I feared about what would happen if and when the content of the transcript or the content of the MEMCON leaked.
This was the first and only time where you went from listening to a presidential call directly to the national security lawyer, is it not?
Yes, that's correct.
Frankly, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was probably an element of shock that maybe in certain regards my worst fear of how our Ukraine policy could play out was playing out, and how this was likely to have significant implications for U.S. national security.
And you went immediately and you reported it, didn't you?
I did.
Why?
Because that was my duty.
So when the president says now that he held up security assistance because he was concerned about rooting out corruption in Ukraine, that concern was not expressed in the 2 phone conversations that he had with President Zelensky earlier this year. Is that right?
Correct.
As early as July 25th, the same day President Trump spoke with President Zelensky on the phone and asked for this favor, the same day that President Zelensky thanked the United States for its military support and signaled it was ready to purchase more javelins. On that date, you got inquiries, your staff got inquiries from someone at the Ukrainian embassy who was concerned about the status of the military assistance. Is that correct?
Sir, that's correct. I would say that specifically the Ukrainian embassy staff asked what is going on with Ukrainian security assistance.
And did that connote to you that they were concerned that something was in fact going on with it?
Yes, sir.
And you received, I guess your staff received more than one inquiry on that date. What was the nature of the other inquiry on July 25th?
Sir, that was the one inquiry to my staff, but the other points that I had raised were emails reflecting outreach to the State Department.
So the Ukrainian embassy was also contacting the State Department to find out about its portion of military assistance?
Yes, sir.
The next day, July 26, 2019, I attended meetings at the Presidential Administration building in Kyiv with Ambassador Taylor, Ambassador Volker, and Ambassador Sondland, and I took notes during those meetings. The delegation then met with President Zelensky and several other senior officials. During the meeting, President Zelensky stated that during the July 25th call, President Trump had, quote, 3 times raised some very sensitive issues.
Did you understand what President Zelensky was referring to when he said the sensitive issues?
I couldn't be sure what he was referring to until I later read the transcript of the July 25th call, but I was aware of various contacts between the three amigos and his government about this set of issues.
And after you read the call, what did you determine to be the sensitive issues that President Zelensky referenced?
The Burisma Biden investigation. Ambassador Sondland, who was to fly out that afternoon, stayed behind to have a meeting with Andriy Yermak, a top aide to President Zelensky. As I was leaving the meeting with President Zelensky, I was told to join the meeting with Ambassador Sondland and Mr. Yermak to take notes. I explained to Mr. Yermak's assistant that I was supposed to join the meeting as the embassy's representative and strongly urged her to let me in, but she told me that Ambassador Sondland and Mr. Yermak had insisted that the meeting be one-on-one with no note-taker. I then waited in the anteroom until the meeting ended, along with a member of Ambassador Sondland's staff and a member of the U.S. Embassy Kyiv staff. When the meeting ended, the 2 staffers and I accompanied Ambassador Sondland out of the Presidential Administration building. The 4 of us went to a nearby restaurant and sat on an outdoor terrace. During the lunch, Ambassador Sondland said that he was going to call President Trump to give him an update. While Ambassador Sondland's phone was not on speakerphone, I could hear the president's voice through the earpiece of the phone. The president's voice was loud and recognizable, and Ambassador Sondland held the phone away from his ear for a period of time, presumably because of the loud volume. I heard Ambassador Sondland greet the president and explain he was calling from Kyiv. I heard President Trump then clarify that Ambassador Sondland was in Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland replied yes, he was in Ukraine, and went on to state that President Zelensky, quote, loves your ass. I then heard President Trump ask, so he's going to do the investigation. Ambassador Sondland replied that he's going to do it, adding that President Zelensky will do anything you ask him to do. After the call ended, Ambassador Sondland remarked that the president was in a bad mood. As Ambassador Sondland stated, it was often the case early in the morning. I then took the opportunity to ask Ambassador Sondland for his candid impression of the president's views on Ukraine. In particular, I asked Ambassador Sondland if it was true that the president did not give an expletive about Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland agreed that the president did not give an expletive about Ukraine. I asked why not. And Ambassador Sondland stated that the president only cares about big stuff. I noted there was big stuff going on in Ukraine, like a war with Russia. And Ambassador Sondland replied that he meant big stuff that benefits the president, like the Biden investigation that Mr. Giuliani was pushing. The conversation then moved on to other topics. I briefed the call in detail to the Deputy Chief of Mission, went away for a week, come back, I refer to the call, and everyone is nodding. Of course that's what's going on. Of course the president is pressing for a Biden investigation before he'll do these things the Ukrainians want. There was nodding agreement. So did I go through every single word in the call? No, because everyone by that point agreed. It was obvious what the president was pressing for.
To the best of my recollection, in the August timeframe, the Ukrainian embassy started to become aware of the hold on security assistance, and they were asking if I had any comment on that or if I could substantiate that.
And that was before it became public, is that right?
Yes.
Sometime during the week of August 6 to 10, a Ukraine embassy officer told a member of my staff that a Ukrainian official might raise concerns about security assistance in an upcoming meeting. My staff recall having had meetings with Ukrainian embassy representatives during the month of August, and they believe that the topic came up. My staff also recall thinking that Ukrainians were aware of the hold on security assistance during August.
Ms. Cooper, did you understand similarly that there was an overwhelming interagency consensus to lift the hold, and that OMB, at the direction of the president, was the only roadblock.
Yes, ma'am. I was advocating for a meeting of the cabinet-level principals with the president to explain why the assistance should go forward. Although I heard of attempts to discuss the issue with the president, I never received details about any conversations other than a status update that the hold had not been lifted. Sir, I did express that I believed it would require a notice to Congress, and that then there was no such notice, to my knowledge, or preparation of such a notice.
The delay of U.S. assistance was an all-or-nothing proposition in the sense that if the White House did not lift the hold prior to the end of the fiscal year, September 30th, the funds would expire and Ukraine would receive nothing.
Mr. Giuliani said he believed the Ukrainian president needed to make a statement about fighting corruption and that he had discussed this with Mr. Yermak. I followed up with Mr. Yermak, and he said that they would indeed be prepared to make a statement. He said it would reference Burisma and 2016 in a wider context of bilateral relations and rooting out corruption anyways. And I edited the statement drafted by Mr. Yermak to include these points to see how it looked.
And now to the next day, on August 10th, there's another text exchange between you and Mr. Yermak, who's the same aide that Mr. Giuliani had met in Madrid. And if you could read what you wrote at the top at 5:02 p.m.
Right. I wrote, I agree with your approach. Let's iron out statement and use that to get date, and then President Zelensky can go forward with it.
And Mr. Yermak responds, once we have a date, we will call for a press briefing announcing upcoming visit and outlining vision for the reboot of U.S.-Ukraine relationship, including, among other things, Burisma and election meddling in investigations. And what did you respond?
Sounds great.
Going to the next exhibit, Exhibit 10, where, or August 10th, rather, this is between you and Andrei Yermak. What did you say initially in this exchange?
Hello, good. Oh, no, that's Yermak. How was your conversation?
And Mr. Yermak responds, hello, good. My proposal, we receive date, and then we make general statement with discussed things. Once we have a date, we'll call for a press briefing announcing upcoming visit and outlining vision for the reboot of U.S.-Ukraine relationship, including, among other things, Burisma and election meddling in investigations. And you respond, got it. That was your understanding of what this statement had to say to satisfy Mr. Giuliani, is that right?
Yes.
And then ultimately to satisfy the POTUS deliverable?
Yes.
Now, text of the exchange, this one's between Ambassador Volker and Andrei Yermak, the same aide to Zelensky that Volker texted before the July 25th call. You weren't involved with it, so I'll read it. The first text is from August 10th. Ambassador Volker text, I agree with your approach. Let's iron out the statement and use that to get date, and Prez can go forward with it. Then at 5:42, Mr. Yermak responds, once we have a date, we'll call for a press briefing announcing upcoming visit and outlining vision for a reboot of U.S.-Ukraine relationship, including, among other things, Burisma and election meddling in investigations. Andrei Yermak says that once we have a date, they will announce the investigations in Burisma and election meddling. Mr. Ken, are these the same two investigations President Trump asked the Ukrainian president to initiate in the July 25th meeting, 25th call?
Those appear to be the same issues that were mentioned in the call, as well as the media campaign that started in March led by Rudy Giuliani.
The next day you write an email to Ulrich Breckbull and Lisa Kenna. Are you able to see that on your
Yeah, I can see
screen?
it on the screen, yeah.
Okay. What is the subject of the email?
Ukraine.
And can you read what you wrote there?
Mike, and I'm referring to Secretary Pompeo, Kurt and I negotiated a statement from Zelensky to be delivered for our review in a day or two. The contents will hopefully make the boss happy enough to authorize an invitation. Zelensky plans to have a big presser on the openness subject, including specifics next week.
And in your opening statement, you said that the specifics, what did the specifics represent?
The 2016 and the Burisma,
And when you say the boss, who do you mean by that?
President Trump,
And the invitation is what?
to the White House meeting.
And Lisa Kenner, let's go to the next day, where there's another text exchange. And at the top, could you just read the first
Yes.
text there?
It says, "Hi, Andre, good talking. Following is text with insert at the end for the 2 key items. We will work on official request."
And then you'll see the highlighted portion of the next text. The other is identical to your previous one, and then it just
And then
adds,
it
including
includes that. Correct.
including these involving Burisma and the 2016 elections. Is that right?
That is correct.
And that was what Mr. Giuliani insisted on adding to the statement?
That's what he said would be necessary for that to be credible.
And the Ukrainians ultimately did not issue this statement. Is that right?
I then discussed it further with Mr. Yermak. He said they did not want to mention Burisma or 2016, and the idea of putting out a statement was shelved.
And Mr. Giuliani said that if the statement did not include Burisma and 2016 election, it would not have any credibility. Is that right?
That's correct.
And President Zelensky ultimately did not get the Oval Office meeting either, did he?
Not yet.
But you certainly understood at that time, did you not, that it was the president's direction and instruction that a White House meeting with President Zelensky would not occur until President Zelensky announced publicly the investigations that the president wanted. Is that right?
That's correct.
By August, I was becoming more concerned. On August 16th, I exchanged text messages with Ambassador Volker in which I learned that Andrei Yermak, a senior advisor to President Zelensky, had asked that the United States submit an official request for an investigation into Burisma's alleged violations of Ukrainian law, if that is what the United States desired.
Mr. Kent, were you aware of any formal Department of Justice cooperation request made to the Ukrainians?
I am not aware that there was any formal Department of Justice request in this matter, no.
By mid-August, because the security assistance had been held for over a month for no reason that I could discern, I was beginning to fear that the long-standing U.S. policy of support for Ukraine was shifting. I called State Department Counselor Ulrich Breckbuhl to discuss this on August 21st. He said he was not aware of a change in policy, but would check on the status of the security assistance. My concern deepened the next day on August 22nd during a phone conversation with Mr. Morrison. I asked him if there had been a change in policy of strong support for Ukraine, to which he responded, "It remains to be seen." He also told me during this call that the president doesn't want to provide any assistance at all. That was extremely troubling to me, as I had told Secretary Pompeo in May, if the policy of strong support for Ukraine were to change, I would have to resign. Based on my call with Mr. Morrison, I was preparing to do so.
In August, you testified at your deposition that you met with Kurt Volker, I believe it was on August 20th. The hold on security assistance was still in place. You testified that Ambassador Volker told you that if he could get Zelensky to make a public statement, quote, that would somehow disavow any interference in U.S. elections and would commit to the prosecution of any individuals involved in election interference, it might lift the hold on security assistance. Is that correct?
Sir, I believe that I testified that it was my inference that that would lift the hold on Ukraine's security assistance.
And that was your inference because at the time you were talking about the hold on security assistance?
That's correct. The first part of our conversation was about the hold on security assistance.
You talked about the hold on security assistance and that he brought up this public statement that they wanted Zelensky to get that he thought might be useful.
That is correct, sir.
I'm going to move ahead to August 22nd. And you wrote an email to Secretary Pompeo, directly to Secretary Pompeo, CCing Lisa Kenner with the subject of Zelensky. And could you please read what you wrote to Secretary Pompeo?
Mike, should we block time in Warsaw for a short pull-aside for POTUS to meet Zelensky? I would ask Zelensky to look him in the eye and tell him that once Ukraine's new justice folks are in place mid-September, Zelensky should be able to move forward publicly and with confidence on those issues of importance to POTUS and to the U.S. Hopefully that will break the logjam.
And Secretary Pompeo responds to you 3 minutes later, yes. So once that new prosecutor was in place, then President Zelensky, should be able to move forward publicly and with confidence on those issues of importance to POTUS. What did you mean by those issues of importance to POTUS?
Again, the 2016 election and Burisma investigation.
So what did you mean here when you said logjam?
Well, as I said to Chairman Schiff, I meant inclusively anything that was holding up moving forward on the meeting and the Ukraine-U.S. relationship.
And what was holding that up?
At that point, it was the statements about Burisma and the 2016 elections.
But what was being held up?
Well, the aid was being held up, obviously.
Shortly thereafter, on August 27th, Ambassador Bolton visited Ukraine and brought welcome news that President Trump had agreed to meet President Zelensky on September 1st in Warsaw. Ambassador Bolton further indicated that the hold on security assistance would not be lifted prior to the Warsaw meeting, where it would hang on whether President Zelensky was able to, quote, favorably impress President Trump.
Ambassador Bolton recommended that I send a first-person cable to Secretary Pompeo directly, relaying my concerns. I wrote and transmitted such a cable on August 29th, describing the folly I saw in withholding military aid to Ukraine at a time when hostilities were still active in the east and when Russia was watching closely to gauge the level of American support for the Ukrainian government. The Russians, as I said at my deposition, would love to see the humiliation of President Zelensky at the hands of the Americans. I told the Secretary that I could not and would not defend such a policy. Although I received no specific response, I heard that soon thereafter, the Secretary carried the cable with him to a meeting at the White House focused on security assistance for Ukraine. The same day that I sent my cable to the Secretary, Mr. Yermak contacted me very concerned, asking about the withheld security assistance. The hold that the White House had placed on assistance had just been made public that day in a Politico story. At that point, I was embarrassed that I could give him no explanation for why it was withheld.
You're not able to give them a reason for the hold. No one is able to give them a reason for the hold. They know the president wants these investigations, and then they're told in Warsaw by Ambassador Sondland, essentially, you're not getting the aid unless you do these investigations, correct?
That's correct.
So, you've been asked, how could there be conditioning if the Ukrainians didn't know? But Ukrainians were told by Ambassador Sondland, were they not?
They were. They were.
So we're clear, you reported 2 concerning conversations that you had with Ambassador Sondland to the lawyers in early September, in which you understood from him that the president was withholding security assistance as additional leverage to get Ukraine to publicly announce the specific political investigations that President Trump had discussed on the July 25th call. Is that accurate?
I was concerned about what Ambassador Sondland was saying were requirements, yes.
Right. And you understood, though, that the investigations that Ambassador Sondland was referring to were the 2 that President Trump referenced on the July 25th call, correct?
By this point, yes.
Ms. Williams, you testified that in your opening statement that you attended the September 1st meeting between Vice President Pence and President Zelensky in Warsaw. Is that right?
That's correct.
What was the first thing that President Zelensky asked Vice President Pence about at that meeting?
President Zelensky asked the Vice President about the status of security assistance for Ukraine. President Zelensky explained that more than, or just equally with the financial and physical value of the assistance, that it was the symbolic nature of that assistance that really was the show of U.S. support for Ukraine and for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I think he was stressing that to the Vice President to really underscore the need for the security assistance to be released.
And that if the United States was holding the security assistance, is it also true then that Russia could see that as a sign of weakening U.S. support for Ukraine and take advantage of that?
I believe that's what the President Zelensky was indicating.
Now, after this larger meeting with Vice President Pence and President Zelensky, you testified at your deposition that you saw Ambassador Sondland immediately go over and pull Andrei Yermak aside and have a conversation. Is that right?
I mean, it was President Zelensky left the room, Vice President Pence left the room, and in sort of an ante-room, Ambassador Sondland and Presidential Advisor Yermak had this discussion, yes.
And what did Ambassador Sondland tell you that he told Mr. Yermak?
That the Ukrainians would have to have the Prosecutor General make a statement with respect to the investigations as a condition of having the aid lifted.
And you told Ambassador Taylor about this conversation as well, is that right?
I promptly reached out to Ambassador Taylor to schedule a secure phone.
I was alarmed by what Mr. Morrison told me about the Sondland-Yermak conversation, but this was the first time that I had heard that the security assistance, not just the White House meeting, was conditioned on the investigations. Very concerned, on that same day, September 1st, I sent Ambassador Sondland a text message asking if we are now saying that the security assistance and a White House meeting are conditioned on investigations. Ambassador Sondland responded, asking me to call him, which I did. During that phone call, Ambassador Sondland told me that President Trump had told him that he wants President Zelensky to state publicly that Ukraine will investigate Burisma and alleged Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election. Ambassador Sondland also told me that he now recognized that he had made a mistake by earlier telling Ukrainian officials that only a White House meeting with President Zelensky was dependent on a public announcement of the investigations. In fact, Ambassador Sondland said, everything was dependent on such an announcement, including security assistance. He said that President Trump wanted President Zelensky in a public box by making a public statement about ordering such investigations. In the same September 1st call, I told Ambassador Sondland that President Trump should have more respect for another head of state, and that what he described was not in the interest of either President Trump or President Zelensky. At that point, I asked Ambassador Sondland to push back on President Trump's demand. Ambassador Sondland pledged to try. I understood that to mean that President Trump, through Ambassador Sondland, was asking for President Zelensky to very publicly commit to these investigations, that it was not sufficient to do this in private, that this needed to be a very public statement. On September 5th, I accompanied Senators Johnson and Murphy during their visit to Kyiv. When we met with President Zelensky, his first question to the senators was about the withheld security assistance.
Now, a few days later, on September 7th, you spoke again to Ambassador Sondland, who told you that he had just gotten off the phone with President Trump. Isn't that right?
That sounds correct, yes.
What did Ambassador Sondland tell you that President Trump said to him?
If I recall this conversation correctly, this was where Ambassador Sondland related that there was no quid pro quo, but President Zelensky had to make the statement and that he had to want to do it.
The following day, on September 8th, Ambassador Sondland and I spoke on the phone. He confirmed that he had talked to President Trump, as I had suggested a week earlier, but that President Trump was adamant that although this was not a quid pro quo, if President Zelensky did not clear things up in public, we would be at a stalemate. I understood a stalemate to mean that Ukraine would not receive the much-needed military assistance. Ambassador Sondland said that this conversation concluded with President Zelensky agreeing to make a public statement in an interview on CNN.
And so even though President Trump was saying repeatedly that there is no quid pro quo, Ambassador Sondland relayed to you that the facts of the matter were that the White House meeting and the security assistance were conditioned on the announcement of these investigations. Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding.
On September 8th, you sent a text to Ambassador Taylor and Ambassador Volker. Can you read what you wrote there?
Guys, multiple convos with Zelensky, POTUS, let's talk.
And so this was September 8th at 11:12 8:20 in the morning. And Ambassador Taylor responds immediately, "Now is fine with me." And if we could go to the next exchange. Ambassador Taylor then 15 minutes later says, "Gordon and I just spoke," or 20 minutes later rather, "I can brief you if you and Gordon don't connect," speaking to Ambassador Volker. Then Ambassador Taylor an hour later says, "The nightmare is they give the interview and don't get the security assistance. The Russians love it and I quit." You would agree that in this text message, after you had spoken an hour earlier with Ambassador Taylor, that he is linking the security assistance to this interview, this public announcement by President Zelensky. Is that right?
Absolutely. On September 8th, Ambassador Taylor told me, quote, "Now they're insisting Zelensky commit to the investigation in an interview with CNN," which I took to refer to the three amigos. I was shocked the requirement was so specific and concrete. While we had advised our Ukrainian counterparts to voice a commitment to following the rule of law and generally investigating credible corruption allegations, this was a demand that President Zelensky personally commit on a cable news channel to a specific investigation of President Trump's political rival.
I was in communication with the DoD Security Assistance Implementing Community to try to understand exactly when they would reach the point at which they would be unable to obligate all the funds by the end of the fiscal year. I received a series of updates, and in a September 5th update, I and other senior Defense Department leaders were informed that over $100 million could not be obligated by September 30th.
The next day, September 9th, I said to Ambassador Sondland and Volker that the message to the Ukrainians and the Russians we send with the decision on security assistance is key. With the hold, we have already shaken their faith in us. I also said, I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with the political campaign. Ambassador Sondland responded about 5 hours later that I was incorrect about President Trump's intentions. The president has been crystal clear, no quid pro quos of any kind. During our call on September 8th, Ambassador Sondland tried to explain to me that President Trump is a businessman. When a businessman is about to sign a check to someone who owes him something, the businessman asks that person to pay up before signing the check. Ambassador Volker used the same language several days later while we were together at the Yalta European Strategy Conference. I argued to both that the explanation made no sense. The Ukrainians did not owe President Trump anything, and holding up security assistance for domestic political gain was crazy, as I had said in my text message to Ambassador Sondland and Volker on September 9th. Mr. Castro, as we've determined, as we've discussed here, on September 11th, just before any CNN discussion or interview, the hold was released.
They got caught. You're aware, aren't you, Ambassador, that 2 days before the aid was lifted, this inexplicable aid was lifted, Congress announced it was investigating this scheme. You're aware of that, aren't you, Ambassador?
I am now, yes.
The next day, I personally conveyed the news to President Zelensky and the Ukrainian foreign minister. And I again reminded Mr. Yermak of the high strategic value of bipartisan support for Ukraine and the importance of not getting involved in other countries' elections.
Ms. Cooper, was DOD able to put all the security system funds into contract before the end of the fiscal year?
No, sir.
And how much were they not able to obligate? What was left unobligated?
I believe the figure was 35 million. We were able to actually obligate 88% total.
And I think you mentioned that you were able, because of legislation the Congress passed, continuing resolution, to do that. Is that right?
So the remainder, we are in the process of obligating right now
The remainder.
because of the provision in the continuing resolution.
Right. So, but for literally an act of Congress, you couldn't have spent all the money.
If we had not received the provision in the continuing resolution, we would have obligated 88%, but not the full amount.
Right, which of course would be a violation of law to not spend money that Congress appropriated.
Sir, I am not a lawyer, but that is my understanding.
Sure.
Ambassador, I want to direct your attention to a meeting you had with Ambassador Taylor and Mr. Yermak September 14th in Kyiv. Do you recall this meeting, sir?
I believe we had dinner. It was around the time of the YES conference.
Okay. And do you remember discussing with Mr. Yermak Ukraine's intent to investigate their former president, Mr. Poroshenko?
I cautioned Mr. Yermak to say that pursuing prosecution of President Poroshenko risks deepening the divisions in the country, exactly the opposite of what President Zelensky has said he wants to do.
So it's fair to describe it as you discouraged him from such action.
I discouraged him. I raised concerns about what the potential impact would be.
And what was Mr. Yermak's response?
I believe, and I'm refreshed in this by seeing the testimony of others.
Mr. Taylor.
Mr. Taylor's testimony.
Ambassador Taylor and Mr. Kent.
Right, and I believe based on that testimony that Mr. Yermak said, well, what, you mean like asking us to investigate Clinton and Biden?
Thank you both for your participation here today and for your service. I want to take us out some 30,000 feet for a minute and talk about cover-ups. But for the fact that the whistleblower came forward, we wouldn't know anything about this. But for the fact that the Inspector General of the CIA found it to be both urgent and credible, we wouldn't know anything about it. Mr. Morrison, you said that after you heard the call, you went directly to the attorneys in the National Security Council and recommended that they be limited access, and they were subsequently put into a special server. The White House has not released any documents whatsoever to this committee. So to you, Mr. Volker, thank you. But for the fact that you, as a private citizen with your own personal phone and your text messages with Mr. Giuliani and Mr. Sondland and Mr. Mayak and whomever else, but for those text messages that we've been putting up on the screen all day, we would have nothing. Nothing. And this cover-up would be complete.
You realize when you came forward out of sense of duty that you were putting yourself in direct opposition to the most powerful person in the world. Do you realize that, sir?
I knew I was assuming a lot of risk.
And I'm struck by that word, don't worry, that phrase, do not worry, you addressed to your dad. Was your dad a warrior?
He did serve. It was a different military, though.
And he would have worried if you were putting yourself up against the President of the United States, is that right?
He deeply worried about it because in his context, there was the ultimate risk.
And why do you have confidence that you can do that and tell your dad not to worry?
Congressman, because this is America. This is the country I've served and defended, that all of my brothers have served, and here, right matters.
Thank you, sir. Yield back.
Ms. Demings.
And Dr. Hill, you cautioned us on the dangers of members of this committee, perhaps peddling any Ukrainian conspiracy theories that could benefit Russia. And I want to ask you if you have heard the name Lev Parnas of Ukraine, someone in this investigation who was influencing President Trump and Rudy Giuliani about some of the debunked conspiracy theories you referenced earlier.
I have heard his name, yes.